Stereo guitar tones. Are they a good idea or are they completely unnecessary? We are going to discuss in this video coming up. Also, before we get into the topic of stereo guitar tones, it is really important that you are listening in a stereo environment. So put on your headphones or listen through your studio monitors or other stereo speakers so you can fully understand what we are looking at in this video. What's up, friend? My name is Matthew Dale, and I am here to help you play better, sound great, and understand more. And today we're going to be taking a look at stereo guitar tones, stereo versus mono, and how to kind of think about various stereo guitar rigs. First, before we get started, I want to give a shout out to my patrons in my Diving Deeper community over on Patreon. Diving Deeper features exclusive lessons, videos, and resources to learn even more about theory, tone, and technique. It's only $5 a month, and if you want to learn more, you can hit the link in the box below. So specifically, before we talk about stereo guitar tones, let's have a very clear definition on what stereo is. Stereo really requires two things to be happening. Two separate pieces of information and two separate speakers delivering that information. So our typical stereo setup is we have a speaker on the left side and a speaker on the right side. If we're listening to the same thing on either side, that's going to be still a mono source. We might call that dual mono. But stereo really requires separate sonic information to be coming out of each of those speakers. So if you listen to the effects on my guitar right now, I've got a stereo reverb, so the reverb is nice and wide, and you also hear that ping-pong delay happening on either side. So those are two bits of separate information. This is great because it actually gives us a more natural listening experience to what we experience with our ears. Of course, human hearing is actually far more detailed than just what two speakers can give us, because we can also hear things a little bit more in the three-dimensional space. We can hear things near, far, behind us, above us, below us. Our human hearing is actually very intelligent in that way. But stereo is still kind of the industry standard when it comes to listening to high-fidelity music or other audio sources. Even though things like 5.1 and 7.1 surround sound do exist, we are typically not listening to our music in those specific environments. We can, and some people do mix for 5.1 or 7.1, but the majority of our listening experiences come in through stereo sources. So, in a nutshell, that's what stereo is. Two speakers left and right with separate information, giving us a more natural listening experience. But there are still a lot of common mistakes when it comes to stereo. Some of these are actually kind of funny, and I'm going to share these. And one involves a student. So if that student is watching in particular, I do apologize, but this is kind of a funny story. We were setting up in a lesson, and of course, here in my studio, all of my Fractal gear, I'm a Fractal guy, all of my Fractal gear is running stereo to my soundboard and my interface. So my FM3 left and right out to the board, my FM9 left and right, Axe effects left and right, even when I plug in my HX Stomp left and right. I like creating stereo guitar tones. And he brought his own gear over. He had a Fender Hot Rod Deluxe and his pedal board, and he was running out of the stereo out left and right from one of his pedals into input 1 and input 2. And I noticed this, and I saw this, and I said, what's with the 2 cables? And he goes, oh, for stereo. And I kind of paused just to see if he would kind of logically get to the conclusion I was going to ask, and he didn't. So I just mentioned stereo guitar. He goes, yeah. Out of 1 speaker? and the look of defeat on his face, he's, oh. And I'm like, yeah, so that's not what those inputs are there for. One is a higher gain input, and one is a lower gain on that particular amplifier. Also, as I went on to explain, not only is it incorrect to think that we can somehow get stereo out of 1 speaker, but it's also incorrect for how to use your typical guitar amplifier. You don't want to plug in 2 things at the same time to either of those inputs. They're still 1 channel. Here's another common one, balanced audio. I see this one on the internet and on forums every so often. It kind of pops up, but is balanced audio stereo? The answer is no, it's not. Balanced audio means something completely different, and I will probably devote another video to balanced audio because I really like the topic, especially when you understand how balanced audio works. It makes your gigging life much easier. So I think the confusion happens when we see like a stereo source or a stereo track, maybe in a DAW or on an effect or something, and we usually read the words balance somewhere on that. You can move the balance to the left or the right, and that can be kind of confusing. Balanced audio is something that has to do with delivering a signal, typically over long signal runs. 50, 100 feet, whatever. The balance on a stereo source shifts it from left to right, and they are not the same thing. So if you see a balanced DI out, that's not a stereo DI out. That's still mono. So now that we have a little bit of a better idea on what stereo is, why would stereo guitar tracks or stereo guitar be advantageous? Again, in something of a nutshell, when using stereo properly, it can give us a deeper and richer guitar listening experience, and sometimes a more realistic experience to listening to a guitar in a room, since the sound in a room is bouncing all around and coming to your ears from a variety of different directions. It can be a little more realistic. It can also provide for us a cleaner guitar signal, in particular if we're using a lot of effects, and I'll demonstrate that here in a little bit. There are various ways that we can actually set up a stereo rig with our guitars, though. So let's talk about some of the common ones. The most common, and I would say the one that you are most likely to use, would be stereo effects. So over here on my Axe Effects, I'm just going to demonstrate a couple of these here. I'm using one of my preset templates that you can find on Patreon. This one's called Modern Flare, and I just altered it a little bit to, make this video. So these are stereo effects. The reverb and the multi-tap delay that I'm using here are in stereo, and it's a very common modeler thing that all of our cable runs within modelers are already stereo. They provide separate left-right information. In particular, if I just mute the reverb, that's what my delay is doing. You can hear that on both sides. And here's the reverb, which you can hear kind of this big expanse of this reverb. It's a cloud-based reverb. If I sum these to mono, I'm going to use a volume block for this to just put my left and right dead in the center so that it's the same source. It's summing everything to mono. We can hear how this gets much smaller. Versus, you can hear it get wide. Same can be true for other like modulation pedals. Chorus, in this case, I have a flanger. This is a stereo flanger, so let's hear it in stereo. Now, let's hear it summed. If we just listen to the flanger in mono, it actually sounds like the mix got higher. So here it is in stereo. Mono. Let's do the same thing with the chorus. So let me bypass this. I'm going to pull in a chorus here. I'm just going to hook this up in parallel so that we can hear it. And mix all the way up. And I'll leave that stuff right there. This is already an analog stereo chorus. I already like the sound. I like the sound of stereo chorus quite a bit. Mono. It just gets smaller, and with chorus, in my opinion, it just gets cheesier. It just sounds like it's that cheesy chorus sound. This sounds much cooler, in my opinion. And here I am back to dry. So stereo effects with reverbs and delays and modulations work really, really well. Keep in mind, my amplifier, I'm only using one amplifier here, and we should also make note that 99.99% of guitar amplifiers are mono. They take a mono signal and deliver a mono signal. There are only a couple of extra examples that aren't. The JC120, technically, it's a stereo amplifier, and it delivered stereo chorus. Really, the JC120 was two 60-watt amplifiers going to each speaker to deliver that big, lush chorus. So my bass guitar tone here is, for the most part, mono. You can hear that doesn't change much. When I put this volume pan to sum everything to mono, it doesn't change much. It does change a little bit, and this is something that I like doing just for me. You can try this and see if you like this as well. But I like to do separate cabinets or cabinet IRs. Usually could be something really similar like a greenback, but with a couple of different microphones. In this case, I'm using V30s, one with a ribbon mic and one with a dynamic mic. And I actually have these hard panned in stereo. So here is the dynamic microphone. And here's the ribbon mic. So the ribbon mic is just a little bit, it's a touch darker, and the dynamic is a touch brighter. I like to hard pan these just for, like, down here in my studio, the feeling of it being a little bit more amp in the room. I know that's a buzzword, and I have called it out on my channel as being a buzzword, but this does give me a better in-the-room experience with a modeler. And here we are, mono sum again. So that, again, is some separate left-right information going on. I can actually take this same signal and make it quite a bit wider by flipping the phase on one side. That's what I'm doing with this filter block right here. There's a phase invert on our filter block, and I am going to flip the left side. And what this gives me is what we're typically hearing right down the middle in mono. I'm going to flip it, and we're going to hear everything way off to the sides. If you are still listening in mono, then you probably haven't really noticed anything in this video up to this point. However, in that example, if you are still listening to mono, it is going to absolutely kill the guitar tone like this. And that's called phase cancellation. That's one thing that we really want to be aware of when we are hooking things up in stereo. This phase trick, and any sort of phase trick, if you're doing the 2290 on a delay, which flips one side of the delay for a very wide delay sound, it's not going to work if you don't have your guitar tone hard panned in either direction. This only works if you have separate information going to each speaker. Again, here is this basically in mono. And then a little more stereo. This is actually kind of what like stereoizers do as well, especially something like the enhancer block in our Fractal stuff. It's doing roughly that same sort of thing. This actually gives us quite a bit of room to keep things out of the middle of a mix. So if I'm playing rhythm guitar, and I'm going to put this rhythm sound up thanks to the Archaean amp in the Axe-Fx. And if I'm straight up and down the middle, sometimes this can just be a lot of information that can compete with a vocalist or a group of vocalists. But if I throw them to the outside and leave that space for our singer in the middle, things can sound a little bit better in a mix. Obviously, take this with a grain of salt. It really kind of depends on what you're going for, but this is one of those tricks of the trade. Of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention where our typical stereo guitar setups come from, and that would be dual amp setups. This is how to do this in the real world. If you have stereo effects on your pedal board, you need 2 amps to do a stereo rig. So I'm going to build one here real quick. I've called up another preset that I have here using the 59 bass guy. I'm just going to bring our volumes back down. I'm just going to clean it up a little bit. And I'm going to put in, this is going to be kind of like the classic combination of a Fender and a Vox on either side. So I'm going to do this and make another pathway here. And we're going to go back into this. Let's get a AC20. I'm going to do my go-to AC20 stuff here. AC20 go-to. Now, what I'm going to do is balance. Here's our balance again. I'm actually going to throw this all the way over to the left side, and I'm going to throw this all the way over to the right side. So now I have sort of the real-world equivalent of stereo amps. You also might want to make sure that you level these out properly. So if I play either of these, you can see that my levels are relatively matching. If I mute out our Vox, now that little blip on the right side, that's actually from my reverb. So that is the Bassman. If we take a listen to the AC20, I say Vox, I mean it's a Morgan AC20, but I think you get what I mean. You can see that those are relatively the same level. There's our stereo amp setup. And now we can actually take, we can utilize the benefit of stereo with some stereo effects before the amp and cab. Let's put a delay in here. And I'll start actually with the 2290. And you can kind of hear that those delays are thrown further to the outside. We can do some additional tricks if I do go back, if I reset this, and I just go back to a digital mono. This is just a mono delay going to both amplifiers. I can further increase the width by delaying one side. This is a psychoacoustic sort of thing. If we hear a source, the same source, but it's hitting one ear sooner than the other, we hear them separately, and it actually throws the sound out wider. So here is this delay with a little bit of right post delay. Here it is with nothing. Mono, about 10 milliseconds or so. If we wanted to further go on the deep dive, I could flip the phase of one of those sides. And now I have stereo amps and stereo effects. I could get a different stereo effect like my chorus that I did earlier. And I might just bring the mix down on some of this stuff here. Now, this next example is not actually going to be stereo, but it is worth mentioning in this context as a dual input source for your guitar tones. And that's wet-dry. So wet-dry could be stereo if you're doing, a wet-dry-wet. That would be all of your wet effects, modulation, reverb, and delay in stereo, and then going to either different amplifiers or into front of house on separate channels apart from your main dry guitar tone. I'm going to actually demonstrate that here with a combination of the Axe Effects and with my mixer, and I'll kind of show you how I'm doing this and what's going on. So the output block has some special stuff with regard to it. So I could actually take this. This is row 2, the multi-tap delay. I could pan this all the way right. And row 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, I could pan my reverb all the way right. And I can pan my row 3, my dry signal, all the way to the left. And now what I have is the basis for a wet-dry rig. Right now, because I'm still in actual stereo, left and right spread out, it's not going to sound like anything particularly good. You just hear the effects on one side, and you hear the dry tone on the other. But if I go back into my mixer and I change some things around, and I un-stereo link my Axe Effects channels, now I've got a fader for just my dry guitar tone. So, in essence, hooking up to a soundboard looks the exact same as stereo. 2 inputs going into the desk or whatever. But what I have now and what an engineer, sound engineer has is a separate fader specifically for my effects. This is good because I don't have to worry as a player, I don't have to worry about whether or not my reverbs and delays are too much or too little for the room that I'm in or for the part of the song. Here they are, balanced, right around unity gain. Maybe that's a little too much. I can bring that back down. And I can hear my actual playing a little more over the effects. That's a wet-dry rig, and if you want to do something like this, actually, and if you even want to do stereo, it's worth communicating with your sound engineer what is going on in your rig. Are you doing stereo, separate left-right stuff? Are you doing wet-dry? Dry signal on one, wet signal on the other. So if you do want to take advantage of all of the good stuff that could be had with stereo guitar rigs, stereo effects, dual amp tones, blended or hard panned, extra wide guitar tones to make room for a singer, or even a wet-dry rig, it is important to know how each of these things would not only affect you as a player, but affect the overall setup of your band or your show or whatever. Now, I hope that you found this conversation around stereo guitar tones interesting and enlightening. Once again, my name is Matthew Dale. I'm here to help you play better, sound great, and understand more. I used a lot of the Fractal ecosystem to demonstrate a lot of these things today, and I am a huge Fractal fan. I absolutely love the Axe-Fx 3, the FM9, and the FM3. I love them so much that I put a dedicated course together to teach you how to use these fantastic pieces of gear. It's called Fractal Fundamentals, and if you are a little bit overwhelmed at the sheer volume of stuff to learn with regard to any of these 3 pieces of gear, I recommend that you check out Fractal Fundamentals. Thanks so much for hanging out with me today, and I will see you in the next video.